Honestly, a guy trying to scrub the smell of cheap burlap and dried straw out of my armpits for a solid week is literally the exact opposite of why I started Sovereign Justice. But here we are. I guess when a neighborhood busybody decides your lawn art is a personal attack, you just have to lean into the crazy and sweat it out. Anyway, let's see how this plays out.
92 degrees. That's what the thermometer on my porch read. And that wasn't even factoring in the Sarasota humidity, which currently felt like breathing through a hot, wet gym sock. I was standing in the middle of my front lawn, a pair of heavy-duty gardening gloves dripping sweat from my fingers, admiring my handiwork. His name was Bartholomew. He was a masterpiece of agricultural intimidation. I'd built him out of a rusted iron cross frame I found at a scrapyard. That boy stuffed an old pair of my grandfather's overalls with prime golden straw and topped him off with a burlap sack that I had painstakingly painted with a face that I like to call mildly judgmental void. He was glorious. He wasn't meant to be creepy, not really. He was just meant to keep the absolute plague of grackles from treating my freshly seeded bahia grass like an all-you-can-eat buffet. But of course, in a neighborhood where the lawns are manicured with literal nail clippers and the mailboxes all match by unwritten decree, Bartholomew stuck out like a sore burlap thumb. I stepped back, wiping my brow with the back of my wrist, and that's when I heard it. The sound that strikes fear into the heart of any homeowner enjoying a peaceful Tuesday afternoon. The sharp, aggressive click-clack of sensible heels on hot pavement. "Excuse me?" I didn't even turn around immediately. I just let out a long, slow breath. "Yes, Mrs. Gable?" I turned to face her. Mrs. Gable, though she embodied the meme so perfectly it felt like a copyright infringement, was standing at the edge of my driveway. She was president of the local neighborhood association. Notice I didn't say homeowners association. We didn't have one. This was a legacy neighborhood, built in the 70s, free from the tyrannical grip of CC and Rs. But Mrs. Gable ran the voluntary association like she had a direct line to the Supreme Court. She was clutching a clipboard. She always had a clipboard. "What?" she demanded, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at Bartholomew. "Is that?" "That," I said, leaning casually against my rake, "is Bartholomew. He's outstanding in his field. Or, my front yard. Keeps the birds away." "It is a hideous, threatening eyesore," she shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch that I'm pretty sure made the neighborhood dogs wince. "It is completely out of character with the aesthetic harmony of Elmwood Estates." "Mrs. Gable, we live next to a guy who has a rusted-out Camaro on cinder blocks in his driveway, and a lady who paints her garden gnomes to look like the cast of Jersey Shore. I think Bartholomew fits the aesthetic harmony just fine." "Don't you get smart with me, young man. That thing," she shuddered, looking at the burlap face, "is satanic. It's looking right at my living room window. It's an aggressive act. I have a right to the quiet enjoyment of my property without having a heart attack every time I open my blinds." "It doesn't have eyes, Mrs. Gable. It's painted on, with a Sharpie. If it's looking at your living room, it's doing it purely through vibes." She narrowed her eyes, her lips pressing into a thin, white line. "You have exactly 24 hours to take down that creepy piece of garbage, or I am calling the authorities. We have standards here." "Call them," I smiled, dropping the rake. "I'll wait." She gasped, actually gasped, spun on her sensible heels, and marched back across the street to her impeccably beige house. I knew she wasn't bluffing. She had the Sarasota Police non-emergency dispatch number on speed dial right next to her podiatrist. I went inside, grabbed a cold Gatorade, and sat on my porch. 20 minutes later, a white cruiser rolled slowly down the street, parking half on the curb. Officer Miller stepped out. He looked like a man who was counting the days until his pension kicked in. He adjusted his duty belt, sighed heavily, and walked up my driveway. I've dealt with Miller before. He's a good guy, mostly just exhausted by the sheer volume of petty disputes he has to mediate in this zip code. "Hey, Miller," I called out, raising my Gatorade. "Hot one today?" "Don't hey Miller me," he grumbled, taking off his sunglasses to wipe his forehead. "So," he looked at me, then slowly turned his head to look at Bartholomew. He stared at it for a long, uncomfortable 10 seconds. "Is that what she called about?" "Yep, says it's threatening." Miller sighed again, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Look, man, between you and me, that thing is deeply unsettling. Why does it look like it knows my sins?" "It's just the angle of the jawline," I laughed. "It's a Scarecrow, officer. It's on my private property. It's not violating any noise ordinances. It's not blocking the right-of-way, and last I checked, there's no law against bad taste in lawn ornaments." "You know that, and I know that," Miller said, leaning against my porch railing. "But she's claiming it's a public nuisance, says it's designed to intentionally cause her emotional distress. She used the words terroristic lawn care." Terroristic lawn care? That's a new one. Did you write that down in your little notebook? "I'm not writing anything down because there's no crime here," Miller said, putting his sunglasses back on. "But I'm warning you, she's a prolific litigator. She's got money, she's got time, and she's got a brother-in-law who is a real estate attorney. She's going to make your life miserable over this pile of sticks." "Let her try," I said, a grin spreading across my face. "I've got time too." Miller shook his head, walking back to his cruiser. "Napuan, don't say I didn't warn you. And seriously, put a hat on it or something. It's freaking me out." I didn't put a hat on Bartholomew. Instead, I gave him a little scarf. It really brought out the void in his face. The very next afternoon, the escalation began. I was checking my mail when I found a thick, heavy stock envelope sitting on top of the junk mail. It had the embossed logo of Gable, and Associates on the corner. I ripped it open. It was a formal cease and desist letter, or 4 pages of dense legalese accusing me of creating a visual nuisance, intentionally inflicting emotional distress, and, hilariously, creating a public safety hazard. According to her lawyer, who I assume was the aforementioned brother-in-law, Bartholomew was so terrifying that he posed a distraction to drivers, creating a traffic hazard on our quiet, 25 MSPH residential street. They demanded the immediate removal of the effigy within 48 hours, or they would petition the City Code Enforcement Division to levy daily fines and seek a court order for its removal, at my expense. I sat at my kitchen table, spreading the papers out. This was the moment. This is what I live for. You try to bully me with a fake HOA and a threatening lawyer letter? We don't just fold. We dig in. We find the loophole. I opened my laptop and started digging into the Sarasota County municipal codes. I scrolled past the setbacks, the fence height restrictions, the noise ordinances. I knew she was going to push the nuisance angle hard with the city inspector. A scarecrow is basically garbage on a stick if the city decides it is. They can fine you for overgrown grass. They can definitely fine you for a 10-foot burlap monster. But I wasn't just decorating. I needed to elevate Bartholomew. I needed to make him untouchable by local municipal zoning. That's when the light bulb went off. The Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act of 2000. Commonly known as ORA-LUIPA, and its state-level counterpart, the Florida Religious Freedom Restoration Act, FRFA. The law states that a government cannot implement land use regulations that impose a substantial burden on the religious exercise of a person, unless the government demonstrates a compelling interest. If Bartholomew was just a scarecrow, he was a target. But if Bartholomew was a sincerely held religious icon, if he was a shrine, suddenly, Sarasota code enforcement would be stepping on the third rail of constitutional law. I picked up my phone and called Big Mike. Mike was a local contractor I'd used before. He was 6'4", built like a brick outhouse, and asked absolutely zero questions as long as the check cleared. "Mike," I said when he picked up over the sound of a circular saw. "I need a project done. Fast. Can you come by this afternoon?" "What's the gig?" Mike grunted. "I need a platform built in my front yard. 4 feet high, sturdy, maybe some nice decorative trim. Needs to be solidly anchored." "A platform? Like a deck?" "Like an altar, Mike. Like a shrine. For a religious effigy." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The circular saw spun down. "You want a what?" "A platform for my religious effigy, Mike. Do you want the money or not?" "Hey, your money is as green as the church's," Mike chuckled. "I'll be there at 4. Mike showed up in his beat-up Ford F-250. Took one look at Bartholomew and burst out laughing. "That's the effigy." "Have some respect, Mike. That is the physical manifestation of the first tabernacle of the straw man." Mike shook his head, pulling his tape measure off his belt. "You are out of your damn mind. Where do you want the altar?" "Right here." I pointed to the exact spot Bartholomew was already standing. "Center of the yard. Maximum visibility." For the next 2 days, Mike and I built. We poured concrete footers. We used pressure-treated lumber. We built a beautiful 4-foot raised dais with a little staircase leading up to it. It looked like a miniature stage. I mounted Bartholomew securely to the center post. I went online and filed the paperwork to register the First Tabernacle of the Straw Man as an unincorporated religious association in the state of Florida. It cost me $85 and took 20 minutes. I printed the certificate, framed it, and mounted it to the base of the platform. The trap was set. Now I just needed the cheese. Karen did not disappoint. True to the threat in her lawyer's letter, she bypassed the police this time and went straight to the heavy hitters. City code enforcement. I got a tip-off from a neighbor who hated Karen just as much as I did, that she had scheduled a neighborhood blight inspection with a senior city official for Thursday at 2 p.m. She was going to walk the official right up to my property line and demand Bartholomew be torn down under Section 14, 32 of the Municipal Code regarding unsightly conditions. Thursday, 1:45 p.m. It was time for the climax. I walked out to the platform. I took Bartholomew down. I carefully unpinned the burlap sack. I unbuttoned the grandfather's overalls. I carried the rusted iron frame into the garage. Then, I went into my house. I put on a pair of thermal underwear. A terrible idea in Florida. But necessary for the padding. I pulled the rough, scratchy overalls on over them. I stuffed loose straw from a bale I bought at Tractor Supply down my sleeves, into my boots, and out of the collar of a faded flannel shirt. Finally, I took the burlap sack, the one with the mildly judgmental void painted on it, and pulled it over my head. I had cut tiny, almost invisible slits in the dark paint of the eyes so I could see. I walked out of my front door, breathing through the burlap. It smelled like dust and vengeance. I climbed the 3 wooden steps up to the platform. I stepped onto the spot where Bartholomew used to stand. I raised my arms out to my sides, locked my knees, and became the Scarecrow. It was 1:55 p.m. Standing perfectly still is incredibly difficult. Within 10 minutes, a bead of sweat began to trace a slow, agonizing path down my spine. My nose had an itch so profound I thought I was going to hallucinate. A mockingbird landed on the edge of the platform, looked at me, chirped aggressively, and flew away. But I held it. I was a statue. I was the straw man. At exactly 2:05 p.m., I heard them. "I'm telling you, Inspector Davies, it is an absolute menace to the community." Mrs. Gable's voice pierced the humid air. I saw them through the tiny slits in my burlap mask. She was practically dragging a tired-looking man in a short-sleeved button-down shirt holding a tablet. "Mrs. Gable, I understand your concern," Inspector Davies sighed, sounding just as exhausted as Officer Miller. "But as I've explained, art is subjective, unless it's structurally unsound or violating a specific setback." "Look at it!" she screamed, pointing dramatically at my yard. "He built a stage for it. It's mocking us. It's... Wait." She stopped dead in her tracks at the end of my driveway. She squinted. Did he change it?" she muttered. Davies looked up from his tablet. "Change what, ma'am? It's a scarecrow on a wooden deck." "It looks bulkier," she whispered, taking a step closer. I didn't breathe, I didn't blink, I focused all my energy on being an inanimate object. "Ma'am, it's just a yard decoration," Davies said, typing something on his screen. "I don't see any code violations here. The platform is under the height requirement for a permit, and it's well within his property line." "It's not just a decoration," she hissed, stomping onto my grass. "It's a hazard, it's dangerous. Look at it. It looks completely unstable." She marched right up to the base of the platform. I was 4 feet above her. She glared up at the burlap face. I stared right back through the tiny slits. "See?" she yelled back at the inspector. "It's a piece of trash. It's probably full of rats." She reached up. She grabbed the leg of my overalls. She yanked. Hard. I didn't move my body, but I slowly, deliberately, lowered my arms, reached down, and placed my gloved hands firmly over hers. Karen froze. The silence in the yard was deafening. I could hear the rhythmic buzzing of a cicada in the oak tree. I could hear a lawnmower 3 streets over. I could hear Karen's breath hitch in her throat. Very slowly, I tilted my burlap head down to look directly at her. "Can I help you, Mrs. Gable?" I asked, my voice muffled but clear through the rough fabric. Karen let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a gasp. It was the sound a balloon makes when you let the air out of it by pulling the neck tight. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and for a split second, I genuinely thought she was going to pass out. She stumbled backward, tripping over her own feet, and landed flat on her backside in the bahia grass. "Jesus Christ!" Inspector Davies yelled, dropping his tablet. I stood up straight, unpinning the burlap sack and pulling it off my head. My hair was matted with sweat and loose straw. I took a deep, gulping breath of the humid Florida air. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," I said, smiling down at them from my altar. "And Mrs. Gable, what brings you to the tabernacle this fine day?" Karen was scrambling backward like a crab, pointing a shaking finger at me. You're a psychopath. Inspector, did you see that? He ambushed me. He tried to attack me." "Attack you?" I jumped down from the platform, dusting the straw off my shirt. "Mrs. Gable, you trespassed onto my private property, approached a religious altar, and physically assaulted an ordained minister while he was in the middle of a sacred meditation rite. I think you've got this completely backward." Inspector Davies was staring at me, his mouth slightly open. "A what? A minister?" "Yes, sir." I walked over to the base of the platform and tapped the framed certificate. "The first tabernacle of the straw man. Legally recognized in the state of Florida, this platform is our sanctuary. Standing motionless for 4 hours is a core tenet of our faith, representing the stillness of the earth before the harvest." Davies looked from the certificate, to me, to Karen, who was now hyperventilating on the lawn. "You've got to be kidding me." "I take my faith very seriously, Inspector. And under the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, any attempt by the city to enforce zoning codes to remove this sanctuary would be a substantial burden on my religious exercise. Unless, of course, the city of Sarasota wants to explain to a federal judge why my faith is a blight." Davies picked up his tablet, dusted it off, and looked at Karen. "Mrs. Gable, I am closing this file. Do not call my office about this address again." He turned and walked briskly back to his city vehicle, muttering something under his breath about taking early retirement. Karen finally managed to stand up, her beige slacks stained with green grass. She looked at me, pure venom in her eyes. "You think you're so smart? I will sue you for everything you own. I will call the police and have you arrested for assault." "Assault?" I laughed, pulling off the heavy overalls. "Mrs. Gable, you're the one who grabbed me. You initiated physical contact on my property. In fact..." I pulled out my phone. "I think I'm the one who needs to make a call." I didn't call the police right then. I waited. The next morning, I walked into the Sarasota County Courthouse and filed a petition for a civil injunction for protection against stalking and harassment. I laid out the timeline: the verbal threats, the lawyer's letter, the constant surveillance of my property, and finally the physical trespass and battery while I was peacefully standing in my yard. I attached a copy of the police report I filed later that evening regarding the trespass, and a copy of the video footage from the new 4K security camera I had Big Mike install under the eaves of the house, pointing directly at the altar. It caught the whole thing in glorious high definition. The judge granted a temporary restraining order pending a hearing. Mrs. Gable was legally prohibited from coming within 50 feet of my property line. Do you know what happens when your neighbor, who lives exactly across a standard 30-foot residential street, can't come within 50 feet of your property line? It means she can't use the sidewalk on her side of the street if I'm standing in my front yard. It means if she pulls out of her driveway and I happen to be watering the petunias, she is technically in violation. The fallout was magnificent. The city, terrified of a massive Arluipa lawsuit backed by the ACLU, sent a formal letter officially recognizing my altar as an exempt religious structure and dropping all pending code enforcement investigations. Mrs. Gable's brother-in-law suddenly stopped sending letters when I mailed him back a copy of the federal statute highlighted in neon yellow, along with a polite note asking if he was licensed to practice in federal court. A week later, I was sitting on my porch, drinking an iced tea. Bartholomew was back on his perch, looking magnificent in the afternoon sun. I had upgraded him. He now wore a tiny, custom-stitched baseball cap that read Sovereign Justice. I watched Mrs. Gable pull up to her house. She got out of her Mercedes, clutching her purse. She looked across the street at me. She looked at Bartholomew. She looked at the giant, permanent floodlights Big Mike had installed that bathed the altar in an angelic, high-lumen glow every night. She didn't say a word. She couldn't. She just turned. Her shoulders slumped and walked quickly into her house, locking the door behind her. Look, I'm not saying I enjoyed having a mockingbird try to build a nest in my earhole while I stood completely rigid for hours on end. But the look on Mrs. Gable's face when she realized she just tackled a 190-pound man instead of a bag of straw? That's better than any spa day. 94 degrees. That's what the oversized, sun-faded thermometer tacked to the siding of my front porch was reading. And honestly, that didn't even begin to factor in the sheer suffocating weight of the Sarasota, Florida humidity. It was the kind of heat that doesn't just make you sweat, it actively disrespects you. It was mid-August, and the air felt like breathing through a hot, wet gym sock that someone had just used to run a marathon. I was standing dead center in the middle of my front lawn, a pair of heavy-duty leather gardening gloves dripping literal sweat from my fingertips, just completely out of breath but admiring my absolute handiwork. His name was Bartholomew, and he was, without a single doubt in my mind, a masterpiece of agricultural intimidation. I had built him from scratch over the weekend because I was at an absolute breaking point. I had just dropped way too much money on premium drought-resistant Bahia grass seed. I had spent 2 agonizing days aerating the soil, spreading the seed, and watering it on a strict schedule. And within 48 hours, an entire organized crime syndicate of local grackles, those shiny, black, yellow-eyed demon birds that plague Florida suburbs, had descended on my property. They were treating my front lawn like an all-you-can-eat buffet, just casually walking around and eating my expensive grass seed right in front of my face. I needed a deterrent. I didn't want chemicals, and I wasn't about to sit on my porch with a BB gun like some kind of neighborhood menace. I needed a classic old-school solution, so I built Bartholomew. I started with a rusted iron cross frame that I had literally dragged out of a scrap pile at Crazy Eddie's salvage yard out on Route 301. It was heavy, industrial, and perfect. For the body, I dug into a plastic tote in my garage and sacrificed an old, heavily worn pair of my grandfather's denim overalls. They smelled faintly of mothballs and ancient motor oil, which I figured added to the overall rustic charm. I drove down to the local tractor supply company, bought a massive bale of golden pine straw, and painstakingly stuffed those overalls until Bartholomew had the imposing, barrel-chested physique of a retired lumberjack. But the crowning achievement, the pièce de résistance, was his head. I took a heavy-duty burlap sack, the kind coffee beans come in, and stuffed it tight. Then, I took an industrial-strength, chisel-tip black Sharpie and drew a face on it. I didn't want him to look like a cartoon character. I wanted him to look serious. So, I gave him a wide, straight line for a mouth and two deep, dark, asymmetrical voids for eyes. I call the aesthetic mildly judgmental void. I topped him off with a crushed, sweat-stained flannel shirt and hoisted him up, burying the bottom of the iron pole deep into the sandy Florida soil right in the middle of my yard. He was glorious. He wasn't meant to be a horror movie prop. He was just meant to keep the birds from bankrupting my landscaping budget. But of course, Elmwood Estates is not a place where logic or reason flourishes. We don't technically have a homeowners association. It's a legacy neighborhood, built back in the late 70s, miraculously free from the tyrannical, legally binding grip of covenants, conditions, and restrictions. However, we do have a voluntary neighborhood association, and it is ruled with an iron acrylic-nailed fist by one Mrs. Karen Gable. I stepped back to wipe the stinging sweat out of my eyes with the back of my forearm, and that's exactly when I heard it. The sound that strikes pure, unadulterated anxiety into the heart of any Elmwood Estates resident trying to enjoy a peaceful Tuesday afternoon. Click-clack, click-clack, click-clack. It was the sharp, aggressive, rapid-fire sound of sensible, 2-inch orthopedic heels hitting the hot asphalt of the street. Excuse me. Young man! I didn't even turn around right away. I just dropped my chin to my chest, closed my eyes, and let out a long, ragged sigh. I counted to 3, plastered a polite, incredibly fake smile onto my face, and turned around. "Afternoon, Mrs. Gable," I called out. "Hot one today, huh?" Mrs. Gable was standing at the absolute boundary line where the public sidewalk met my driveway. She never stepped foot on my concrete unless invited, treating property lines like invisible electric fences. She was wearing perfectly pressed beige capri pants, a floral blouse that hurt my eyes, and oversized sunglasses that covered half her face. In her hands, pressed firmly against her chest like a shield, was her clipboard. She always had the clipboard. It had a little silver pen attached to it with a beaded metal chain. "What in the name of all that is holy?" she demanded, raising one trembling, manicured finger and pointing past me. "Is that monstrosity?" "That?" I said, leaning casually back against the wooden handle of my landscaping rake. "That is Bartholomew. He's outstanding in his field. Or, my front yard. He's my new security system, for the grackles." "It is a hideous, threatening eyesore," she shrieked. Her voice had this incredible ability to bypass the eardrum and vibrate directly in your dental fillings. "It is completely out of character with the aesthetic harmony of this street. It is aggressive." I looked at Bartholomew, who was just hanging there, a gentle breeze rustling the straw poking out of his cuffs. Then I looked back at Karen. Mrs. Gable, honestly, we live next door to a guy who has had a rusted-out 1998 Chevy Camaro sitting on cinder blocks in his driveway since the Obama administration. 2 houses down, Brenda has a collection of garden gnomes that she paints to look like the cast of Jersey Shore. I really, truly think Bartholomew fits the aesthetic harmony of this neighborhood just fine. Don't you dare get smart with me, she snapped, clutching the clipboard tighter. That thing, she shuddered, physically recoiling as she looked at the burlap face, is satanic. It's looking right at my living room window. It's a deliberate, aggressive act. I have a fundamental right to the quiet enjoyment of my property without having a panic attack every time I open my Venetian blinds. It doesn't have eyes, Mrs. Gable. It's literally a burlap sack. I drew the face on with a marker. If it's looking at your living room window, it's doing it purely through vibes and spatial awareness. She narrowed her eyes, pulling her sunglasses down the bridge of her nose so she could glare at me directly. Her lips pressed together into a thin, white, furious line. I am the president of this neighborhood association. We have standards here. We have a reputation to uphold. You have exactly 24 hours to dismantle that creepy piece of garbage and throw it in the municipal waste bin. Or, I am calling the authorities. I will not be terrorized in my own home. I stared at her for a second. The heat was radiating off the driveway in visible, wavy lines. My shirt was completely soaked through. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and honestly, numb, just so profoundly done with her constant power trips. Call them, I smiled. I dropped the rake. It hit the grass with a soft thud. I'll wait right here. She gasped, like an actual, theatrical, pearls-clutching gasp. Excuse me? You heard me. Call the cops, Mrs. Gable. Tell them there is a man in his own yard with some straw and a stick. Let's see what the dispatcher says. She didn't say another word. She spun around on her sensible heels so fast I thought she might blow out a knee. Gable whipped her cell phone out of her ridiculously oversized leather purse and started furiously stabbing at the screen as she power-walked back across the street to her impeccably manicured beige-on-beige fortress. I knew she wasn't bluffing. Mrs. Gable had the Sarasota Police Department's non-emergency dispatch number saved in her phone as a favorite. She probably talked to the daytime dispatcher more than she talked to her own children. I walked up the steps to my porch, sat down in my faded green Adirondack chair, cracked open a lukewarm bottle of store-brand sparkling water I had sitting on the table, and settled in to wait. It took about 35 minutes. A white Sarasota PD cruiser turned the corner onto Elmwood Drive, rolling at roughly 5 miles an hour. It crept down the street, the tires crunching softly against the pavement, before pulling up to my house. The cruiser parked half on the street and half on the lip of my driveway. The engine idled for a long moment before the door popped open and Officer Miller stepped out. I've dealt with Miller before. He's a veteran cop, pushing 50, thick around the middle, and perpetually looks like a man who is actively counting down the hours, minutes, and seconds until his pension vests. He adjusted his heavy black leather duty belt, which let out a loud, strained creak, sighed so heavily his shoulders visibly dropped, and started walking slowly up my driveway. "Hey, Miller!" I called out from the porch, raising my sparkling water in a mock toast. "Beautiful afternoon for it." "Do not hey Miller me today, man. I swear to God," he grumbled, his voice thick with exhaustion. He took off his aviator sunglasses, wiping a thick layer of sweat off his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked at me sitting on the porch, and then he slowly, deliberately turned his head to look at the center of the yard. He stopped walking. He just stood there, staring at Bartholomew. The silence stretched out for a long, incredibly uncomfortable 10 seconds. The only sound was the cicadas buzzing in the oak trees. "Is that?" Miller pointed a thick finger at the Scarecrow. "Is that what she called dispatch about?" "Yep. I nodded, taking a sip of the warm water. Says it's threatening her life. Says it's satanic. Miller let out another sigh, this one somehow deeper than the last. He reached up and aggressively rubbed the bridge of his nose, right where the sunglasses left little red indents. Look, man, between you, me, and the dashboard camera rolling on my cruiser right now, that thing is deeply, profoundly unsettling. Why does it look like it knows my deepest, darkest sins? I burst out laughing. It's just the angle of the jawline. I drew it on with a Sharpie, Miller. It's a scarecrow. I put down grass seed. The birds are eating it. It's on my private property, well, within the property lines. It's not violating any municipal noise ordinances. It's not emitting noxious fumes. It's not blocking the public right-of-way. And last I checked the Florida state statutes, there is absolutely no law on the books against having incredibly bad taste in lawn ornaments. You know that, and I know that, Miller said, finally walking over and leaning heavily against my wooden porch railing. The wood creaked in protest, but dispatch got a frantic call from Mrs. Gable claiming you are harboring a public nuisance. She specifically used the phrase terroristic lawn care and claimed you built it to intentionally cause her severe emotional distress. Terroristic lawn care? I repeated, raising an eyebrow. Honestly, I kind of love that. It sounds like a punk rock band. Did you write that down in your official report? I am not writing a single damn thing down because there is no crime here, Miller said flatly, putting his sunglasses back on and hiding his eyes. It's a civil matter. It's a piece of trash on a stick. But I'm warning you, as a guy who is sick of driving out to this neighborhood, you are poking a very angry, very bored bear. She has no authority, Miller. The neighborhood association is voluntary. She can't fine me. It's not about the HOA, Miller said, lowering his voice slightly and leaning in. She is a prolific litigator. She has money. She has entirely too much free time. And she has a brother-in-law who is a partner at a real estate and civil litigation firm downtown. She sued a guy 2 streets over last year because the wind blew his oak tree leaves into her swimming pool. She claimed it was an intentional trespass of organic matter or some garbage like that. She is going to make your life an absolute living nightmare over this pile of straw. I looked out at Bartholomew. He was standing there, stoic, silent, guarding my precious Bahia grass seed. Then I looked across the street. I could see the blinds in Mrs. Gable's front living room window twitching. She was standing in the dark, watching us, waiting for Miller to pull out the handcuffs and arrest me for the crime of offending her retinas. A slow, creeping grin spread across my face. I could feel the adrenaline, that familiar, beautiful spark of pure, concentrated spite lighting up in my chest. Let her try, Miller, I said softly, leaning forward in my chair. She has money and time? That's cute. I have the entire municipal zoning code memorized, a disturbing amount of patience, and a YouTube channel that thrives on this exact demographic of entitlement. Let her send the brother-in-law. Miller shook his head slowly, pushing himself off the porch railing. He looked at me like I was a patient in a psychiatric ward who had just refused his medication. Don't say I didn't warn you, he muttered, turning to walk back down the sweltering driveway toward his cruiser. What? He paused at the end of the concrete, glancing back over his shoulder at my yard. And seriously, man? Put a baseball cap on it or a scarf or something. It's seriously freaking me out. It looks like it wants to eat my soul. I'll take it under advisement, I called back cheerfully. I didn't put a hat on Bartholomew. Miller got in his cruiser, threw it in reverse, and drove away, leaving me alone in the oppressive heat. I sat on the porch for another hour, just watching the street. The lines had been drawn. The police had formally established that no criminal act was taking place, which meant the field of battle was now strictly civil. It was going to come down to code enforcement, lawyers, and the incredibly boring, beautifully rigid world of municipal law. I finished my sparkling water, crushed the plastic bottle in my hand, and walked back out into the yard. I patted Bartholomew on his rough, burlap shoulder. "Brace yourself, buddy," I whispered to the Scarecrow. "We're going to war." Exactly 48 hours after Officer Miller slowly rolled away from my curb, the real escalation began. I mean, I knew it was coming. You don't just tell a woman like Mrs. Gable to call the cops, watch the cops literally do nothing, and expect her to just go inside and take up knitting. That's not how the suburban ecosystem works. When a neighborhood tyrant loses a battle in front of her own Venetian blinds, she doesn't retreat. She calls in the artillery. It was Thursday afternoon. The heat had somehow actually gotten worse, mutating from a standard Florida swamp into an oppressive physical weight that just sat on your chest the second you opened the front door. I was walking down my driveway in a pair of beat-up flip-flops to check the mail, my shirt already sticking to my back, when a sleek silver Lexus rolled up to my curb. A guy hopped out. He was wearing a slim-fit suit that looked incredibly uncomfortable in the 90-something degree weather, and he had that distinctly exhausted look of a guy who gets yelled at for a living. He was a process server, or a courier, or whatever you want to call the guy who delivers bad news in an expensive envelope. He didn't even look at Bartholomew, which honestly felt a little disrespectful given the sheer amount of craftsmanship I had put into that burlap face. He just walked up to me. It asked to confirm my name, handed me a thick, heavy-stock manila envelope, and practically sprinted back to his air-conditioned Lexus. I stood there in the driveway, flipping the envelope over. It was sealed with actual, physical wax. I am not kidding. Who uses wax seals in this century? The return address, embossed in a font that screamed billable hours, read, "Gable, Gable and Associates, Attorneys at Law." Ah, yes, the legendary brother-in-law. I walked back inside, enjoying that beautiful, frigid blast of central air conditioning, and tossed the envelope onto my kitchen island. I grabbed an ice-cold sweet tea from the fridge, popped the tab, took a long drink, and then grabbed a butter knife to pry open the wax seal. The paper inside was ridiculously thick. It was the kind of stationery that probably costs more per sheet than my first car. It was a formal cease and desist letter. 4 dense, incredibly wordy pages of pure, unadulterated legal intimidation. I leaned against the counter and started reading, and honestly, I found myself actually laughing out loud in my empty kitchen. The letter accused me of creating a malicious visual nuisance. It claimed, and I am quoting this literally, that I was intentionally and recklessly inflicting severe emotional distress upon Mrs. Gable, causing her loss of sleep, elevated blood pressure, and a deprivation of her fundamental right to the quiet enjoyment of her private domicile. But the absolute best part, the absolute crowning jewel of this ridiculous document, was page 3. According to Mr. Gable, attorney at law, Bartholomew was not just a horrifying monstrosity. He was a public safety hazard. The lawyer argued that because the Scarecrow was so deeply unsettling and visually aggressive, it was serving as a deliberate distraction to drivers navigating our quiet, 25-mile-per-hour residential street. He claimed that my burlap sack on a stick was an imminent threat to vehicular safety and a liability to the neighborhood at large. The final paragraph was the ultimatum. They demanded the immediate and permanent removal of the hostile effigy within 48 hours. If I failed to comply, they would immediately petition the Sarasota City Code Enforcement Division to levy maximum daily fines against my property under Section 1432 of the Municipal Code, and they would concurrently seek a court injunction for its forceful removal, with all legal fees and municipal costs billed directly to me. I slapped the papers down on the granite counter. This right here was the exact moment the adrenaline kicked in. This is why sovereign justice exists. People like this lawyer, and people like Mrs. Gable, They rely on the sheer, overwhelming panic that a formal legal threat induces in a normal person. Most people get a letter printed on heavy cardstock with a wax seal, threatening thousands of dollars in fines, and they just fold. They take down the Scarecrow. They paint their door beige. They surrender their property rights because fighting a lawyer seems impossibly expensive and terrifying. But I don't fold. I dig in. I grabbed my laptop, sat down at the kitchen table, and cracked my knuckles. It was time to find the loophole. I started by pulling up the Sarasota County Municipal Zoning Codes. It's a massive, dry, incredibly boring PDF document. But if you know how to read it, it's basically a treasure map. I scrolled past the setback requirements, the fence height restrictions, the noise ordinances, and the permitted exterior paint colors. I found Section 14, 32, the unsightly conditions, and blight clause they were threatening me with. It was frustratingly vague. That's the problem with municipal codes. They are deliberately written to give the city inspector maximum subjective power. If an inspector decides that your lawn ornament is blight or unsightly debris, you are basically entirely at their mercy. You can appeal it, sure, but you're appealing to a board made up of the inspector's buddies. Tonut, if Bartholomew remained just a scarecrow, just a piece of yard art, he was incredibly vulnerable. The city could, theoretically, slap me with a $50 a day fine until I took him down, just to appease a wealthy, litigious resident like Mrs. Gable. I needed to elevate him. I needed to take Bartholomew out of the jurisdiction of local municipal zoning and put him behind a shield that a local city code inspector would be absolutely terrified to touch. I needed federal protection. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. Code enforcement can regulate art. They can regulate sheds. They can regulate trash. But what can't they regulate without triggering a massive, career-ending civil rights lawsuit? Religion. A massive, wicked grin spread across my face. I furiously started typing. I bypassed the local codes and went straight to federal statutes. I pulled up the text for the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act of 2000, universally known in the legal world as RLUIPA. I also pulled up its state-level backup, the Florida Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It was beautiful. It was legal poetry. RLUIPA basically states that a government, including a local zoning board or a code enforcement officer, cannot implement land use regulations that impose a substantial burden on the religious exercise of a person or institution, unless the government can demonstrate a compelling, critical interest, like stopping a literal fire hazard. If Bartholomew was just a scarecrow, he was a target. If I told the city inspector he was just keeping the grackles away, they'd tell me to buy a plastic owl and throw Bartholomew in the dumpster. But what if he wasn't a scarecrow? What if he was a sincerely held religious icon? What if he was a shrine? I opened a new tab and went directly to the Florida Department of State's Division of Corporations website. I clicked on the portal to form a new legal entity. I didn't need to form a massive tax-exempt 501(c)(3) nonprofit. That takes months and involves the IRS. I just needed to establish an unincorporated religious association. In the state of Florida, the barrier to entry for establishing a recognized religious organization is hilariously, beautifully low. I filled out the digital forms. Under Name of Entity, I typed, "The First Tabernacle of the Straw Man." Under Purpose, I wrote, "To observe, venerate, and protect the sacred stillness of the earth through the physical manifestation of the guardian of the harvest." I mean, it sounded like absolute garbage, but legally? Legally, it was bulletproof. The Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled that the government cannot dictate what constitutes a valid religion, so long as the beliefs are sincerely held. And buddy, I was about to hold these beliefs with the sincerity of a dying man. I paid the $85 expedited electronic filing fee with my credit card. I hit submit. The confirmation screen popped up. complete with a printable, legally binding certificate of registration. I printed it out on glossy photo paper. But a religion needs a sanctuary. A shrine isn't a shrine if it's just a stick shoved into the dirt. If I was going to sell this to a city inspector, I needed to make it look official. I needed infrastructure. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in about 8 months. It rang 3 times before a gruff, gravelly voice answered over the deafening, high-pitched scream of a power saw. "Yeah, talk to me," the voice grunted. "Big Mike," I said, leaning back in my chair. "It's your favorite client. Turn the saw off, I have a project for you." Big Mike was a local independent contractor. He was roughly the size of a commercial refrigerator, possessed a beard that looked like it housed several small woodland creatures, and asked absolutely 0 questions as long as your check cleared the bank. We had worked together on a malicious compliance fence dispute 2 years ago, and we had an excellent working relationship. The saw whined down to a halt. "All right, I'm listening. What's the gig? You finally putting in that patio?" "No patio today, Mike. I need a platform built. In my front yard. I need it done fast, like, tomorrow morning fast. I'll pay your emergency rush rate." "A platform?" Mike asked, sounding skeptical. "Like a deck? How big?" "Not a deck. More like a dais. An altar. It needs to be 4 feet high, maybe 5 feet wide, perfectly square. It needs to be built out of premium pressure-treated lumber. It needs solid concrete footers so it can't be tipped over, and it needs a nice, decorative wooden staircase leading up to it. It needs to look intentional. It needs to look permanent." There was a very long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear Mike breathing. "You want me to build you an altar in your front yard, in Elmwood Estates?" "That's exactly what I want, Mike." "What the hell are you sacrificing on it?" "Nothing is being sacrificed, Mike," I laughed. "It's a sanctuary for my religious effigy. Do you want the money or not?" Another pause. Then a low, rumbling chuckle. "Hey, man, your money is as green as the Catholic churches. I'll be at your place tomorrow at 7 a.m. sharp. Have the coffee ready." The next morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon and the humidity already sitting at a thick 90%, Mike's heavily dented, rust-spotted Ford F-250 rumbled down the street. It was pulling a flatbed trailer loaded with heavy timber, bags of quick-setting concrete, and a small cement mixer. Mike threw the truck into park, stepped out in his steel-toed boots, and slammed the door. He walked up the driveway, holding a massive travel mug of black coffee. He looked at me, then he looked at the center of the yard, where Bartholomew was currently swaying slightly in the morning breeze. Mike slowly lowered his coffee mug. He stared at the burlap face for a solid 20 seconds. "I'm going to be completely honest with you," Mike said, his voice completely deadpan. "That is the ugliest, most terrifying piece of garbage I have ever seen in my entire life. Have some respect, Mike," I said, handing him a clipboard with a rough sketch I had drawn the night before. "That is the physical manifestation of the first tabernacle of the straw man, and you are building his sanctuary." Mike just shook his heavy head, took the clipboard, and started pulling his tape measure off his worn leather tool belt. "You are out of your damn mind. You know Mrs. Gable is going to stroke out when she sees me pouring concrete, right? That, Mike, is entirely the point. Let's get to work." For the next 8 hours, we worked like dogs in the brutal Florida sun. We dug 4 deep post holes right in the center of the yard, completely destroying a massive patch of my freshly seeded Bahia grass. We mixed the concrete, poured the footers, and set massive, heavy-duty 4x4 wooden posts perfectly plumb. The smell of sawdust and pressure-treated chemicals hung heavy in the humid air, mixing with the smell of sweat and impending suburban warfare. Mike was a craftsman. Even though he thought the project was completely insane, he didn't cut a single corner. He built a beautiful, incredibly sturdy 4-foot-high platform. We decked it with premium boards, sanded the edges, and built a set of 3 wide, sweeping stairs leading up to the center. It genuinely looked like a miniature stage or a pulpit. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, my front yard looked like a construction site, and across the street the Venetian blinds in misses. Gable's living room window were twitching so violently I was worried she was going to rip them right off the wall. She hadn't come outside once, but I knew she was in there, probably on the phone with her lawyer, screaming into the receiver. "All right," Mike grunted, wiping a massive forearm across his sweaty forehead. He dropped his framing nailer onto the grass. "The altar is done. Bring out the monstrosity." I walked over to where I had laid Bartholomew on the grass during the construction. I picked him up by the heavy iron cross pole, walked up the new wooden steps, and stood dead center on the platform. Mike came up behind me with a heavy-duty steel mounting bracket and a drill. We anchored the iron pole directly into the center structural beam of the platform. Bartholomew was no longer just shoved into the dirt. He was permanently, structurally integrated into the sanctuary. He stood nearly 10 feet tall now, towering over the yard, his burlap face staring blindly out over the street, directly toward Mrs. Gable's front door. I jumped down from the platform and walked back to the street to admire the view. It was perfect. It was imposing. It looked exactly like a bizarre, localized cult compound. I went inside, grabbed the glossy certificate I had printed from the state registry, and slid it into a heavy, waterproof display frame. I walked back out and screwed the frame directly into the bottom step of the platform, perfectly visible to anyone walking up the driveway. The first tabernacle of the straw man, officially registered, legally protected. Mike was packing his tools into the back of his truck. He looked at the finished product, shook his head one last time, and walked over to me. "I don't know what kind of legal loophole you think you've found," Mike said, pulling off his leather work gloves. "But you know she's going to call the city, right? Code enforcement is going to be breathing down your neck by tomorrow afternoon." "I'm counting on it, Mike," I smiled, pulling a wad of cash out of my pocket and handing it to him. "I'm absolutely counting on it. In fact, if you want some free entertainment, you might want to swing by tomorrow around 2 o'clock. I have a feeling we are going to have visitors." Mike took the cash, stuffed it into his pocket, and clapped me hard on the shoulder. "You're a maniac. A literal maniac. But I respect the hustle." He climbed into his truck, the diesel engine roaring to life, and drove away, leaving me alone in my yard with the newly constructed sanctuary. The trap was fully set. The bait was in the water. I had the federal statutes, the state registration, and the architectural infrastructure to back it all up. I looked across the street one last time. The blinds were still parted slightly. "Your move, Karen," I muttered to myself. I turned and walked up the steps of the tabernacle, standing right next to Bartholomew, and let the Florida sun bake the sweat into my shirt. Honestly, I couldn't wait for the city inspector to show up. I honestly didn't even have to wait for the city to send me a formal notice. In a neighborhood like Elmwood Estates, gossip travels faster than fiber optic broadband. I got the tip-off at exactly 9:15 the next morning via a text message from Dave. Dave is the guy 3 houses down who owns the rusted-out 98 Camaro on cinder blocks, and he absolutely despises Mrs. Gable with the fiery passion of 1,000 burning suns. She's been trying to get his car towed since 2014. His text was short, sweet, and beautifully punctuated. The wicked witch just cornered the mailman. She told him to watch his step today because the city is sending a senior code inspector at 2 p.m. to demolish the cult compound. Give him hell. "Buddy!" I texted back a single thumbs-up emoji. It was go time. I had about 4 hours to prepare for what I like to call the Sovereign Justice Special. This is the part where you don't just beat them on paper. You let them completely spectacularly hang themselves with their own rope in front of a municipal witness. At exactly 12:30 p.m., the sun was sitting directly overhead, baking the neighborhood in a brutal, oppressive 96-degree heat. The humidity was physically offensive. I walked out my front door, marched up the 3 wooden steps of the newly built altar, and unbolted Bartholomew from his central post. I carefully unpinned the burlap sack from his head, unbuttoned my grandfather's ancient, oil-stained overalls, and stripped the Scarecrow down to his bare, rusted iron cross frame. I hoisted the heavy metal rig over my shoulder, carried it into my garage, and shoved it behind my lawnmower. Then, I went back inside the house to my bedroom and started the absolute worst physical ordeal of my entire adult life. If you have never deliberately put on a pair of full-length, waffle-knit thermal underwear in Florida in the dead of August, I highly recommend you keep it that way. It is literally an act of self-harm. But I needed the padding, and more importantly, I needed a barrier between my skin and the raw pine straw. I pulled the thermals on, instantly breaking into a full-body sweat before I even left the air conditioning. Next came the overalls. I stepped into them, pulled the heavy denim suspenders over my shoulders, and latched the brass hooks. Then came the stuffing. I dragged the remaining half-bale of golden pine straw out of the laundry room and started jamming handfuls of it down the front of the overalls, packing it tightly against my stomach and chest to give me that bulky, inanimate, barrel-chest look Bartholomew had. I shoved straw down the pant legs, wrapping some duct tape around my ankles over my work boots so the straw wouldn't just fall out the bottom. I threw on the crushed, faded flannel shirt and buttoned it up incorrectly, leaving the collar wide open so I could jam even more straw around my neck and shoulders. I looked in the full-length mirror. I looked ridiculous. I looked like a man who had lost his mind. I guess, technically, I had. Finally, I picked up the burlap sack. The one with the mildly judgmental void drawn on it in thick black Sharpie. The night before, I had taken a razor blade and cut 2 incredibly tiny, almost microscopic horizontal slits right in the darkest part of the Sharpie ink. They were totally invisible from the outside, but if I pressed my face right up against the rough fabric, I had a severely restricted letterbox view of the world. I pulled the sack over my head. The smell hit me instantly. It was an overpowering, suffocating mixture of stale coffee beans, permanent marker fumes, and dry dust. I pulled the rough twine drawstring tight around my neck, tucking the loose ends under the collar of the flannel shirt. I grabbed a pair of heavy, stained gardening gloves, took one last, desperate gulp of the filtered house air, and walked out the front door. It was 12:50 p.m. Walking blind in a burlap sack down your own front walkway is a deeply humbling experience. I practically had to shuffle to avoid tripping over the hose. I found the bottom step of the altar by feeling around with the toe of my boot. I walked up the 3 steps, turned around, and positioned myself dead center on the wooden platform, exactly where the iron post used to be. I took a deep breath, which just tasted like burlap fibers, spread my arms out straight to my sides, locked my knees, and became the Scarecrow. I had to stand perfectly, seated absolutely still for an hour and 10 minutes before they even showed up. Let me tell you, standing completely motionless sounds easy until you are actually forced to do it. Within the first 15 minutes, the Florida sun was beating down on the dark flannel shirt, turning the thermal underwear beneath it into a literal sauna. Sweat started pooling at the small of my back and tracing tall, agonizing, tickling paths down my spine. By minute 30, my left calf began to twitch. By minute 45, the most profound, deeply psychological itch materialized right on the bridge of my nose. I couldn't scratch it. If I moved my arms, the illusion was shattered. I just had to stand there and let the itch slowly drive me insane. Then, At exactly 1:15 p.m., a mockingbird, probably one of the very same birds I had originally built Bartholomew to deter, fluttered down from the oak tree and landed squarely on my right shoulder. I mean, I literally almost broke character right there. The bird felt surprisingly heavy. I could feel its little claws gripping through the flannel and the straw, digging slightly into the thermal underwear. It let out a sharp, aggressive chirp right into my ear. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I just stared straight ahead through the tiny slits in the burlap, focusing all of my mental energy on pure, unadulterated spite. Spite is an incredible painkiller. The bird hopped around on my collarbone for about 2 minutes, pecked at a piece of straw near my neck, and finally flew away. I held the pose. At 1:58 p.m., a white municipal Toyota Prius with the Sarasota County seal on the driver's side door turned onto Elmwood Drive. It rolled silently down the street and parked directly in front of my driveway, right next to the curb. Before the driver could even put the car in park, the front door of the beige house across the street flew open. Mrs. Gable marched out, moving with a terrifying, purposeful velocity. The whim? She was wearing a violently pink pastel blazer, carrying her trademark clipboard, and she looked like she was ready to order an airstrike. A man stepped out of the Prius. He looked to be in his late 50s, wearing a short-sleeved, sweat-stained button-down shirt and a clip-on tie. He was holding a ruggedized tablet. He looked completely and utterly defeated by life. This was Inspector Davies. "Inspector Davies! Finally!" Mrs. Gable yelled across the street, not even bothering to use the crosswalk as she power-walked toward him. "I am so glad you're here. This situation has escalated beyond belief. It is a hostile environment." Inspector Davies sighed, adjusting his glasses. He pulled a handkerchief out of his pocket and dabbed his forehead. "Mrs. Gable, good afternoon. I have your file right here. You filed a complaint regarding an unpermitted, hazardous waste structure and a blight violation at this address?" "Look at it!" she shrieked, coming to a halt next to him and pointing a dramatically manicured finger directly at me. "He built a stage for it, a literal stage. It is an eyesore. It is an intimidation tactic, and it is completely destroying my property values." Davies slowly turned his head. He looked at the 4-foot-high, beautifully constructed wooden platform. He looked at the stairs. He looked at the framed certificate mounted on the bottom step. And then he looked up at me. I was 10 feet away from him, elevated, my arms outstretched. I was a monument to neighborhood defiance. Davies tapped the screen of his tablet a few times. He looked bored. "Ma'am, that's a deck." "It is not a deck," she snapped, her voice cracking. "It's an altar. He told the police it was a religious thing. He's mocking me. He's mocking the entire association. It's a pile of garbage on a stick, and I want it torn down today. Section 14, 32 unsightly conditions. Write him a citation right now and call the municipal demolition crew." Davies let out a long, slow breath through his nose. He walked up to the edge of the public sidewalk, being very careful not to let his scuffed black dress shoes cross the property line onto my concrete driveway. He squinted at the framed certificate on the stairs. "Mrs. Gable," Davies said, his voice dropping into that flat, monotone cadence of a bureaucrat who has explained the same rule 5,000 times. "I cannot order a demolition, and I cannot write a citation for unsightly conditions." "Why not?" She practically vibrated with rage. "Because, ma'am, first of all, the structure is a freestanding, raised wooden platform under 30 inches from the mean grade of the front slope, meaning it does not require a municipal building permit in this county. Secondly, it is set back at least 15 feet from the public right-of-way, meaning it violates no easement ordinances. And thirdly," Davies paused, leaning in slightly to read the certificate, "this property is visibly registered as the sanctuary of the first tabernacle of the Straw Man." "That is a made-up religion," she screamed, stomping her sensible heel onto the pavement. "He made it up yesterday." "Ma'am, with all due respect, I am a code enforcement inspector, not the Supreme Court. I do not have the legal authority to determine the theological validity of a registered state entity. If I issue a blight citation against a registered religious shrine, the ACLU will have my pension in a blender by Friday morning. The structure is legally compliant. The effigy is legally protected. There is nothing I can do." "It's not a shrine," she roared, completely losing whatever thin veneer of suburban civility she had left. "It is a pile of trash. It is dangerous. Look at it. It's probably full of rats. It looks totally unstable. If a strong wind blows, that heavy iron pole is going to snap and go flying through my window." Through the tiny slits in the burlap, I watched her. Her face was flushed bright red. She was panting. She couldn't handle being told no. She couldn't handle the fact that her clipboard had no power here. "Mrs. Gable, the structure appears to be built with heavy-duty pressure-treated lumber and—" "I will prove it to you," she yelled. Before Davies could stop her, Karen crossed the property line. "Larry," she marched right past the inspector, her heels clicking aggressively against my concrete driveway. "Mrs. Gable, do not trespass on private property," Davies warned, taking a half-step forward but stopping at the boundary line. "I cannot protect you if you initiate a civil trespass." She didn't care. She was completely tunnel-visioned. She stepped off the driveway and onto my freshly seeded bahia grass. She marched right up to the base of the wooden platform. I was standing 4 feet above her. Completely motionless. "You see this?" she yelled back at the inspector, pointing up at my burlap face. "It's a joke! He probably just shoved a stick into the wood. It's completely flimsy. I bet if I just pull on it, the whole stupid thing will come crashing down." She looked back up at me. She was so close I could smell her expensive, overpowering floral perfume mixing with the stench of my own sweat. Her eyes narrowed. "Wait," she muttered, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She tilted her head, squinting behind her oversized sunglasses. Did he change it?" She took a step up onto the first wooden stair. "Mrs. Gable, step off the structure," Davies yelled from the sidewalk. "That is a massive liability." She ignored him. She took another step up. She was now standing on the platform, right at my feet. She looked at my boots. She looked at the heavy denim overalls stuffed with pine straw. She looked at the incredibly realistic, bulky way the flannel shirt hung over my chest. "It looks thicker," she whispered to herself. I didn't breathe. I didn't twitch a single muscle. My heart was hammering so hard against my ribs I thought she would be able to hear it through the straw. "It's just trash," she sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "Just a pathetic pile of trash from a pathetic man." She reached her hand out. Her manicured fingers, complete with a massive diamond ring that caught the Florida sun, nuts, extended toward my left leg. She grabbed a thick, heavy handful of my denim overalls right around my knee. And then with every ounce of furious, entitled strength in her body, she yanked. She pulled hard. Like, literally put her entire back into it. If Bartholomew had just been a rusted iron cross shoved into the dirt, she probably would have ripped the whole thing down right on top of herself. But she wasn't pulling on a rusted iron cross. She was pulling on a 190-pound, heavily sweating, fully grown adult male whose knees were locked in a defensive stance. I didn't budge an inch. The abrupt, jarring halt of her momentum completely threw off her center of gravity. Her sensible 2-inch orthopedic heel slipped on the edge of the freshly sanded pine stair. She stumbled forward, her perfectly manicured hand still death-gripping the heavy denim of my grandfather's overalls. She let out a frustrated grunt. Completely confused as to why this supposedly flimsy pile of trash felt like a solid brick wall. She looked up. Her face was maybe 18 inches from my chest. I could literally see the beads of sweat ruining her expensive foundation. This was it. This was the moment I had spent 2 days, $85 in state filing fees, and immeasurable amounts of physical suffering preparing for. I didn't jerk away. I didn't yell. I just slowly, deliberately, and with an agonizing amount of theatrical precision, lowered my arms from their outstretched, cross-like position. The heavy denim and straw rustled loudly in the dead silence of the Florida afternoon. Karen froze. She completely turned to stone. The physical sensation of the Scarecrow moving under her own hand short-circuited her brain. I slowly reached down, my heavy, sweat-stained leather gardening glove descending from above, and I placed my hand firmly over hers, wrapping my fingers around her knuckles. I could feel her entire body trembling through the leather. Very, very slowly, I tilted my burlap-covered head forward. I aligned the tiny microscopic slits in the dark Sharpie marker right with her wind-terrified eyes. I took a deep breath of the stale, stifling air inside the sack. "Can I help you, Mrs. Gable?" I asked. My voice was muffled by the thick burlap, giving it this deep, resonant, almost hollow echo. The sound she made was honestly something I will never forget for the rest of my natural life. It wasn't a scream. A scream implies a level of vocal control. It was this choked, high-pitched, guttural wheeze, like a balloon having the air violently pinched out of its neck. Her eyes rolled back so far I could see the whites all the way around her irises. She released my pant leg like it was physically burning her. She scrambled backward, completely forgetting that she was standing on an elevated platform. Her heels caught the edge of the top stair, and she went over backward, her arms flailing wildly in the air. She tumbled down the 3 wooden steps and landed flat on her backside right in the middle of my precious, freshly seeded Bahia grass. Her pastel pink blazer hiked up to her shoulders, and her sunglasses flew off into the dirt. "Jesus Christ!" That was Inspector Davies. He had dropped his ruggedized city tablet onto the public sidewalk with a loud, expensive-sounding crack. He was clutching his chest, his mouth hanging wide open, staring at me like I had just crawled out of a television screen. I stood up perfectly straight. I reached up, grabbed the rough twine drawstring, and yanked it loose. I pulled the heavy burlap sack off my head and threw it onto the wooden deck of the altar. The sudden rush of 96-degree humid Florida air hit my face, and I guess I've never tasted anything sweeter. My hair was plastered to my forehead with a mixture of sweat and crushed pine straw. My face was flushed bright red. I took a massive, gulping breath, wiped the grit out of my eyes with the back of my leather glove, and looked down at the absolute chaos I had just orchestrated. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," I said, my voice finally clear, looking directly at the terrified code inspector. Then I looked down at the grass. "And Mrs. Gable, what brings you to the tabernacle this fine day?" Karen was practically hyperventilating. She was crab-walking backward across my lawn, crushing the grass seed beneath her hands and feet, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at me. Her expensive hairdo was completely wrecked, sticking up in 3 different directions. You're a psychopath!" she shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical sob. Inspector, did you see that? He ambushed me. He tried to grab me. He tried to attack me." "Attack you?" I laughed, a genuine, booming laugh that echoed down the quiet suburban street. I jumped down from the 4-foot platform, landing lightly on the grass. I started unbuttoning the heavy flannel shirt, completely ignoring the fact that I was dumping handfuls of loose pine straw all over my yard. "Mrs. Gable, let's be very, very clear about what just happened here. You trespassed onto my private property. You bypassed a municipal official. You climbed onto a registered, legally protected religious altar. And then, you initiated uninvited, physical contact, committing battery on an ordained minister while he was in the absolute middle of a sacred, hours-long meditation rite. I took a step toward her. She scrambled backward another 3 feet. "I think you've got this entire situation completely backward, Karen," I smiled. Inspector Davies was still standing on the sidewalk, his tablet forgotten on the concrete. He looked from me, covered in straw and thermal underwear, to the framed certificate on the stairs, and then back to Karen, who was now covered in dirt and grass stains. A minister?" Davies stammered, wiping his forehead with a shaking hand. "Yes, sir." I walked over to the base of the platform and tapped the glass of the framed certificate with my gloved finger. "The First Tabernacle of the Straw Man, officially recognized by the Division of Corporations in Tallahassee. This structure is our sanctuary. Standing completely motionless, embracing the stifling heat for hours on end is a core tenet of our faith. It represents the stillness of the earth before the harvest." I looked Davies dead in the eyes. I dropped the snark for a second and went full legal threat mode. "I take my faith incredibly seriously, Inspector, and as I'm sure you and the city's legal counsel are aware, under the Federal Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act of 2000, any attempt by the City Code Enforcement Division to use zoning codes to remove, alter, or fine this sanctuary would constitute a substantial burden on my religious exercise. Unless, of course, the city of Sarasota wants to explain to a federal civil rights judge why my faith is considered blight because my neighbor doesn't like my aesthetic." Davies stared at me. He looked like a man who was calculating exactly how many months he had left until he could draw his municipal pension. He slowly bent down, picked up his cracked tablet, and dusted off the screen. "Mrs. Gable," Davies said, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. It was the voice of a man who was entirely done with his job. "I am closing this file. Do not call my office about this address ever again. If you have a dispute with this property owner, it is a civil matter, or a criminal one. But it is not a code enforcement issue. Have a good afternoon." He didn't wait for a response. He turned around, walked briskly to his municipal Prius, got in, and drove away before Karen even had time to fully stand up. She finally managed to get to her feet, furiously brushing the dirt off her ruined pastel blazer. She looked like she was about to explode. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated suburban rage. "You think you're so smart," she hissed, her voice shaking. "You think you won. I am going to sue you for everything you own. I will call the police and have you arrested for assault." "You trapped me!" "Assault?" I chuckled, pulling off the heavy leather gloves and tossing them onto the stairs. "Mrs. Gable, you literally grabbed my leg. You pulled on me. You initiated physical contact on my property after ignoring verbal warnings from a city official not to trespass. In fact..." I pulled my cell phone out of the deep pocket of the overalls. "I think I'm the one who needs to make a phone call." She didn't stick around to see who I was dialing. She spun around, marched across the street, limping slightly because she had broken the heel off her right shoe, and slammed the front door of her beige fortress so hard I saw the glass in the windows vibrate. I didn't call the police right then. I went inside, stripped off the disgusting, sweat-soaked thermal underwear, took a freezing cold 40-minute shower, and scrubbed the smell of burlap out of my pores. Then, I sat down at my computer and pulled up the footage from the brand new, a 4K resolution security camera that Big Mike had discreetly installed under the eaves of my roof the day before. It was perfectly framed. It caught the entire interaction in glorious high-definition video. It clearly showed Davies warning her not to cross the property line. It showed her stomping onto my grass, marching up the stairs of the tabernacle, and aggressively grabbing my leg. And best of all, it caught the exact hilarious moment she fell backward into the dirt. The next morning, I drove down to the Sarasota County Courthouse. I didn't file a police report for battery because, honestly, the cops wouldn't care that a 50-something woman grabbed my pants. But the civil court? The civil court cares very much about documented harassment. I filed a formal petition for a civil injunction for protection against stalking and harassment. In the sworn affidavit, I laid out the entire timeline. The verbal threats, the aggressive lawyer's letter, the constant, documented surveillance of my property from her windows, the malicious misuse of city resources by calling code enforcement, and finally, the physical trespass and unprovoked battery while I was peacefully standing on my own property. I attached a USB drive containing the 4K security footage, a copy of the city's Arluepa protections, and a printout of the threatening letter from her brother-in-law. The judge granted a temporary restraining order pending a full hearing. Now, here is the absolute beauty of a temporary restraining order in a residential neighborhood. The order legally prohibited Mrs. Gable from coming within 50 feet of my person or my property line. Do you know what happens when your absolute worst enemy, the woman who has made it her life's mission to control your neighborhood, lives exactly across a standard 30-foot residential street? It means her property line and my property line are only 30 feet apart. If she is standing at the end of her driveway and I am standing at the end of mine, she is in violation of a court order. It means she legally cannot use the public sidewalk on her own side of the street if I happen to be sitting on my front porch. If she pulls her Lexus out of her garage to go to the grocery store and I am watering my petunias near the curb, she is technically committing a misdemeanor violation of an active injunction. I essentially trapped her in her own house. The fallout over the next 2 weeks was absolutely spectacular. The city of Sarasota, absolutely terrified of a massive federal civil rights lawsuit backed by the ACLU, sent me a formal, certified letter officially recognizing the wooden platform as an exempt religious structure and permanently dropping all pending and future code enforcement investigations regarding the effigy. As for her lawyer, the illustrious Mr. Gable, he suddenly stopped sending wax-sealed letters when I mailed him back a copy of the federal Arluepa statute highlighted in bright neon yellow, along with a politely worded note asking if his firm was licensed to practice in federal civil rights court, or if I should expect him to refer the matter out. I never heard from him again. About a week after the restraining order went into effect, I was sitting on my front porch in the Adirondack chair, drinking an ice-cold sweet tea. The sun was starting to set, casting long golden shadows across Elmwood Estates. Bartholomew was back on his perch. I had reassembled him, bolting the rusted iron frame back onto the center post of the altar and restuffing his overalls with fresh pine straw. He looked magnificent. I had even upgraded him. Sitting right on top of his burlap head, slightly askew, was a tiny, custom-stitched navy blue baseball cap that read, "Sovereign Justice." I watched the silver Lexus slowly turn onto the street. Mrs. Gable pulled into her driveway. She hit the button on her visor, and the garage door started to open. She got out of the car, clutching her oversized purse. She didn't look at her phone. She didn't look at her mail. She just stood in her driveway and looked across the street at me. She looked at me sitting on the porch. Tintunt. She looked at Bartholomew towering over the yard. She looked at the giant, industrial-grade permanent floodlights Big Mike had installed that bathed the altar in an angelic, high-lumen glow every single night, ensuring Bartholomew was visible from space. She didn't say a single word. She legally couldn't. She just stood there for a moment, her shoulders completely slumped, defeated by the very system she had tried to weaponize against me. Then, she turned around, walked quickly into her house, and locked the door behind her. I mean, look, I'm not saying I enjoyed having a mockingbird literally try to build a nest in my earhole while I stood completely rigid and sweat to death for hours on end. But honestly, The look on Mrs. Gable's face when she realized she had just tackled a grown man instead of a bag of straw, and the absolute silence of the neighborhood ever since. I guess you could say it was a religious experience.